I'm Patrick Byers, retired Horticulture Field Specialist and Produce Food Safety Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Thank you for joining us for this series of videos on on-farm produce food safety. Water and produce are intimately connected. Farms use water to produce crops, and water is used in harvest and post-harvest activities. Unfortunately, water can be a source of contamination, and issues such as water sources, how water is used, and monitoring of water are all very important aspects of understanding water and produce food safety. Let's first talk about water that is used to produce crops. Three considerations here. First of all, the water source. Secondly, how the water is applied, and how close is that water used relative to harvest. Frequently, the water that's used in crop production may carry some load of contamination, but that's okay as long as the farmer understands how to address that particular risk. Let's first talk about water sources. For many farms, the water source is a well. The first thing to do is to examine the wellhead. Is the well in good condition? Is the casing intact? Is the wellhead area designed in such a way that contaminants flow away from the well rather than close to the well? Another thing that's very important from the standpoint of well water is understanding water quality, and this is done by water testing. Now, farmers should work with a water testing lab that they have confidence in and follow the directions that the water testing lab provides from the standpoint of collecting the sample, holding it, and eventually submitting it to the lab. But in general, most water tests require a specific container for the sample. The water is typically sourced close to the water source. A hydrant close to a wellhead, for example, works really well. The water is allowed to run for a period of time. Then the water nozzle or source of the water is disinfected. The water is allowed to run again, and then the sample is collected. The water sample will need to be a specific quantity of water, and then the sample is handled as per the directions and submitted to the lab. From the standpoint of other water sources, water that is supplied by a municipal or some other governmental body typically is tested by that water authority, and it can be assumed to be safe once it arrives at the farm. Water from surface sources, lakes, streams, or ponds will carry some load of contamination, and it's important to understand the quality of that water. The next thing to consider from the standpoint of water used in producing crops is the distribution for that water. Yes, water may be clean at its source, but it can be contaminated if there's breaks or other problems in the distribution system. So at least annually, check the water distribution system to make sure that there are no leaks. Now let's turn our attention to how that water is used in producing crops. First thing to consider, are you using an irrigation method that actually wets the part of the crop that's going to be harvested? Drip or trickle systems are typically considered to be the safest way to water crops because, again, with the exception perhaps of crops that are very close to the soil or root crops, the water never really contacts the part of the crop that's going to be harvested, and that's safest. Overhead sprinklers, yes, they can certainly be used to produce crops, but overhead sprinklers, of course, do wet the harvested part of the crop. And then finally, we occasionally use water for other purposes, such as to cool crops using a fine mist. This too is going to contact the harvested part of the crop. Anytime water contacts the harvested part of the crop, the quality of that water becomes very important. Another consideration is the amount of time between the application of water that carries some load of contamination and harvest. The longer the period of time, the more likelihood there is that the pathogens in that water will die off upon exposure to the environment. As harvest approaches, it's important to use water that is of good quality. And in fact, switching to a potable water source close to harvest is an effective way to manage the risk related to water that actually contacts the harvested part of the crop. Now let's turn our attention to water at harvest and post-harvest. The first thing to consider is the standard of quality. At this point, all water must be potable or drinking water quality, and typically it's going to come from a municipal source or from a tested well. The next thing to think about is how we're going to actually use that water. A common way that water is used at this point is for rinsing or washing produce. If produce doesn't need to be rinsed or washed, then don't do it. Avoiding water contact is a way to manage potential risk. If you do choose to use water, consider single pass water. This is where the water is used once and then rinses away. Frequently, though, on farms, water is used for more than one batch of produce. This is called batch water or multiple pass water. And this is a risky way to use water because an early group of produce can actually contaminate the water, and then that contamination can spread to the additional batches of produce that are used in that same container of water. One way to manage that risk is to use a sanitizer in the water. And sanitizers at this point must be labeled for use in contact with produce. So check your labels, and there must be a plan in place to replace that water at intervals. Frequently, farmers replace the water when the water no longer tests at an effective level of sanitizer, or when the water visibly carries a load of contaminants, organic materials, or cloudiness. Water is used for other purposes at harvest and post-harvest. As an example, for washing hands, it's also used to clean and sanitize food contact surfaces. Keep in mind that at this point, we're using a multi-step process to keep these surfaces clean. First, the surface is rinsed, then a soap or a detergent is applied, vigorous scrubbing action, and then rinsing, followed by the use of a sanitizer. Now, sanitizers used on food contact surfaces must carry a label for use on food contact surfaces. So remember that water and produce, again, are tightly connected, and water quality plays a significant role from the risk of contaminating produce. So think about water use during crop production. Make sure that you consider the source of the water, the way the water is used, and how close that water is used to harvest. And then when you use water at harvest and post-harvest, again, think about the quality of the water. Think about, do we actually need to wash produce? Think about, are we using single pass, or are we using multiple pass water? And if using multiple pass water, are we using a sanitizer? And then think about the importance of keeping food contact surfaces clean and how water plays a role there as well. As far as records to be kept related to water, it's very important to keep records of related to the well, records related to the at least annual inspection of the water distribution system, records related to water testing. You know, these are all important parts of the records that a farm should be keeping. I'm Patrick Byers, retired Horticulture Field Specialist and Produce Food Safety Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Thank you for joining us for this series of videos on produce food safety.